I'm Mark Sefter.
And I'm Linda Zeiss Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Arcane Mark. Today, we are going to be talking about playing with senses. And so this is generally about the 5 and more senses and how to use them to make your game more engaging and exciting.
That's right.
So, one of the things that is advice that I got certainly coming in as an adventure developer, and is something that I like to give as advice to authors as well, is that there's a tendency in descriptions to over rely on sight and to sort of not bring in the other ways that the characters experience things. So maybe we can talk about sight first and then branch out, since sight is the one that really tends to get hit the hardest.
All right. So we're going to be talking about not only the use of descriptions with the senses, potentially engaging those senses of the players out of the game, but also running those senses in the game. So, and Alftro is right that Game Master Guide has a good sidebar about using other senses, and there is the core rulebook in Game Master Guide does have some information on that as well. But vision is in the game of Pathfinder 2nd Edition is defined as the sense that is typically a precise sense for a lot of different types of creatures, where a precise sense in Pathfinder 2nd Edition is defined as a sense that can allow a creature to be fully observed. You are not taking any kind of mischance. You are not having to deal with... It's just like they're there, you know where they are, and you could target them normally. For many creatures, vision is the sense, and the only sense that allows for that. And Starfinder also has a kind of similar way of dividing things out too, where a sense is called like a blind sight, like vision. It's a little bit sighted terminology, but it's essentially like, oh well, if this one lets you do what we would say is a precise sense in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, it's a blind sight, and if it doesn't, then it's just a blind sense in Starfinder. So with vision, obviously, when it comes to descriptions, like Linda said, descriptions that you'll see in box text tend to rely heavily on vision. Even if someone is following the advice to include the other senses, you're not going to see a box text that says, you open the dungeon room. This room has a tapestry of smells. You smell the sewer air coming from down below, which might be a sewer grate, but you don't. You just smell that, and there's a smell of straw coming from what might be a back corner of the room, as well as freshly cut grass. And then they just stop. It's like, but do we see anything? No. We don't overrely on sight. We're only going to talk about what you smell in the room.
Let's tip the camera forward a little bit. Your mouth is covered.
Covered. Is it for too much?
That's a little too much.
How about now?
Much better.
All right,
there we go.
So, essentially, whether or not we're you adding other senses, which you absolutely should, generally vision is where you're going to get a lot of the descriptive text. When it comes to visuals for the players, well, there's a lot of ways to do that. You can have art in a monster book that you show off, miniatures, and sort of miniatures and a battle mat are pretty much 100% exist to engage the player's visual sense on allowing for a visual spatial representation of what's going on in the battle. Props can potentially have a major visual aspect to it, and
and when giving descriptions, of what people experience, there's a big difference between like just using the game term for something and coming up with a way to try to describe it in a way that's what the PCs would see. Because if you're like, oh, you see a ring of protection +2 sitting on the ground, like that, as opposed to saying that, as opposed to describing an antique ring studded with rubies that radiates faint heat and has inscribed runes on the side. Like sometimes I find that like giving descriptions of what the PCs actually see, and also tailoring that to sort of what their knowledge would be. I mentioned a ring here, but what you see this more often is with creatures, right? Where it's like, where if you just say like the name of a creature, then that can tend to get players, particularly ones who play a lot more, in the sense of like, yes, I'm gonna call up what I remember and the statistics of the creature. But if you're just like, oh yeah, you see an orc, and they're like, oh yes, those are the facts that I know about orcs. Whereas if it's like, you see this tall, green-skinned, muscled person wearing such and such and such, then that they might think like, okay, well maybe it's an orc, but maybe it's something else. Particularly when you have characters that don't fit exactly with the stereotypes of what PCs would assume things look like. Like if you have PCs who are very familiar with the way that certain creatures are typically described. Like I know that it was sort of a thing where like in first edition, like folks who played a lot would start to memorize that top level bestiary line description and be like, yes, you've described it with this sentence. This is this creature. But shaking up the way that you describe things and what you focus on can help the players get into this sense of what are their PCs seeing and what are their PCs experiencing, as opposed to like, what is this monster stat block and the numbers that I need
Another aspect of PCs see things based on their own experiences is, think about the background of a character. If a character grew up as a peasant versus another character grew up as a jeweler among the nobility, the jeweler, when you describe like a character that they meet, be like, yes, and they have a ring of Chalcedony. The peasant is not gonna, even if the peasant actually has enough knowledge that if they rolled a recall knowledge, they would be able to identify Chalcedony. That's not gonna like stand out.
Yeah.
To the peasant necessarily. It's not gonna be the first thing they see is to figure out which gems the person is wearing, because all senses, and vision is one of them, give so much information that what you pull out of that is filtered based on like your own life experience.
Also, another thing to play with on this is perception too. Like if you know that the character has a particularly high or low perception bonus, you can influence the way that you describe things. Or if somebody's like, oh, they're an investigator, whether they're a capital I investigator with a class, or like someone who's always looking for really close details versus someone who's paying, like, are they someone who pays more attention to what someone is wearing? Are they someone who pays more attention to someone's facial expression? Are they someone who cares more about, are they someone who's always looking to see if someone might be a little bit shifty-eyed? What are they focusing on whenever that character is asking for description?
Just as the same way that like a movie or a TV show, you can kind of like see the directors and the camera's gaze based on like where they focus things. The PCs have their own unique gaze, and that can determine what's focused on. Just like,
and you can go in the other direction too, where you can use descriptions to focus the PC's gaze. If you have like a group of people that the PCs are talking to, and you describe one of them as wearing a vibrant red coat embroidered with gold thread, and the other ones you don't describe what they're wearing or what they look like, then the players are naturally going to be like, let's talk to the one with the red cloak. So you could use these sort of details to signal to the players, this is where I'm zooming in to focus.
That's right. So when it comes to vision, from a non-descriptive but mechanical sense, because of the fact that it's a precise sense, there's a huge amount of different rules that get into like whether you can see something or not.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, there is the concealed condition, which means like You can see it, but you don't have a great full vision of it. Maybe it's in mist or the lights are pretty low. And that causes you to have to make a pretty easy flat check, but still, there's a 20% chance you'll fail it when you're going to target that creature. Then you can also have something that is hidden. That means that you can't see it, but you know where it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's in this area, but you can't see it. And then there's undetected, which is you don't even know exactly where it is. When we get to the other senses, you probably haven't heard it recently enough to be certain where it is right now. Like, you're not hearing its breathing and movements right now. And then there's something called unnoticed, which is you don't even know it's there, which it would have had to have been at least to remain undetected, and you just never knew it had showed up in the area.
Breast Liquid has a cool proposal for describing characters. One thing that Brexa thinks about with characters is the idea of a person leading with a particular part of the body, describing different parts of the body for each NPC to highlight what the character is associated with. Someone who's nosy, or fidgets with their hands, or tends to puff their chest out. So that's a cool idea for like coming up with ways to pick those key features whenever you want to draw the player's attention into a character.
Absolutely. So because of the fact that we have these like concealed and hidden and undetected, there's also a bunch of rules involving getting to that point. Mm-hmm. So in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, you take the hide action, appropriately enough, will take you from not being hidden to being hidden. And then the sneak action takes you from there to undetected because you sneak around somewhere and now they don't know exactly where you are anymore. Mm-hmm. There's also invisibility, which makes it so that you can't be seen whatsoever, meaning that the best that the enemy can hope for is that you're hidden, unless they have another precise sense, because that's if you're like shouting or they know exactly where you're standing, but you're invisible, then you're going to be hidden. Yeah. Similarly, darkness effects that are too dark for someone to see through because they don't have dark vision will also make pretty much everything in there is going to be hidden or undetected because they're, essentially the same as if they were all invisible to you. Mm-hmm. And being hit by a blindness spell will do the same thing where everything is going to be hidden at best.
Yeah. Another thing I noticed with descriptions too is it can be interesting to play around with when either the character who you're describing things for is colorblind or the light level is low. Descriptions that don't rely so much on color but rely on things more like texture and shape.
Yeah.
Especially when it gets really dark and you're just left with like shadows with a particular shape. It can be fun for that to give people like a bit of a description of what they see and then try to get them to figure out like, oh, what's that a shadow of that I can barely see in the distance.
That's true. And I definitely had a game at one point where the entire group was using dark vision from magic items and they killed a silver dragon, which they thought was a red dragon.
Oops.
Until someone shined a light eventually and was like, oh, this isn't red. But there was a description of like the head of the silver dragon does look different, but nobody really had the right knowledge skill anyway.
So they just fought first and didn't ask questions?
Yeah, the silver dragon and like the Baron's daughter like eloped. But with that typical like the dragon's kidnapping me.
Yeah, I see.
And the PCs killed the dragon.
Good job, PCs.
Yeah. Oh well. Eventually the Baron's daughter poisoned her husband that she was forced to marry, who was terrible, and became the new Baroness. Anyway,
I don't think I heard that story.
This fire is so hot it feels like ice.
Yes.
They were definitely confused about that, but one of the reasons it pretended to be a red dragon was also because anybody who attacked it was going to use the wrong element. And it did have, I think it had like Burning Hands as one of its spells, so that it could do some fire if it needed to for effect.
Oh yeah, Kitsune has a good point. I never thought about how much vision and detection play a role in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. I mean, I feel like that's part of why you see this playing so much in fantasy RPGs is that this idea of like invisibility versus versus like having some kind of a life sense or
absolutely
hiding and sneaking and the senses of dragons and all that kind of stuff.
So vision is the sense that comes up the most.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also like a bunch of other senses that aren't even weird fantasy senses that everybody has. So everyone has their own senses, and obviously not everyone has all of the senses, because you could have prosopagnosia or and not be able to like necessarily feel things the same, or anosmia, or anything else.
So everybody's gonna have different a different suite of senses.
That's right.
Some of the but it's cool to use a variety of them in the way that you describe the world. So
typically for a lot of creatures, the most common imprecise sense is hearing. So an imprecise sense is defined as a sense that can really narrow down exactly where something is, but you don't see it. So you're not getting like the full orientation of exactly the way that their body is moving. You're not getting all the information that that you would normally get if you're looking at them. But it's still it's easy enough that like in the game sense of the 5 foot square, like if you hear them, they're shouting and stomping their feet, even if they're invisible, which 5 foot square they're in. And so that's sort of the definitional imprecise sense. And hearing is that. So when it comes to hearing, obviously, any time that you talk and you say something, that's using the sense of hearing, unless it's with telepathy, for example. Which means that when you're role-playing for the players, things like using different vocal patterns or accents on your voice, can or vocal quality as well, can be a way to engage the sense of hearing. You can add music, even if the music isn't literally happening to their characters, to engage the player's sense of hearing. Sound effects like the Sirenscape or other things that play sound effects can also be a way to engage the player's sense of hearing.
And describing sort of where a sound comes from, like here the classic, hearing something coming up from behind you or hearing something coming from above or a really weird direction. Because I know that this is something I in particular am very bad at, like directional hearing. But I know that for a lot of folks it's easy for them to tell like where something is relative to them. Based on where they hear it. Like for me, it's like I can generally tell like it's somewhere in this arc, but I'm not sure if it's ahead or behind me, and I have to like go around and check for volume as I walk around.
Linda's hearing may be a vague sense.
Yeah, and I actually probably is. So again, not everything's not the same for everybody, but
that's true.
But that can be a cool thing to play around with.
But at least the human sense of hearing and a lot of other creatures even in the real world is capable of being what is described in the game as imprecise, even if Linda's is not.
Yeah.
It provides enough information for those who are skilled at using their sense of hearing that you could do that with it. So obviously, there's spells like silence that can cause a creature to not make sound, or the higher level silence that can create an area where there is no sound in the game. There's also some creatures who just have a precise sense of hearing, basically like an echolocation, where they kind of are emitting sounds and then listening and using their sense of hearing to figure out exactly where something is, or even if they don't emit their own sounds, using sense of hearing to pinpoint exactly where something is. So, and there are creatures in the game as well that just have completely different senses, or they might not have hearing. You could have a character who doesn't have a sense of hearing as well. Same for vision. And generally, when you're playing, when you want to think about characters who don't have certain senses, or are people who have other disabilities, it's really, really important to talk between the players and the GM about what you're playing and why you're playing it, because it's really important to allow representation of characters who are characters with a disability, but it should not be a reason to like sort of almost in the Daredevil sense fetishize a disability and be like, oh well, yeah, since this character is blind, that means they're like a superhero automatically, or it really depends on what the fantasy is, and particularly if it's the fantasy of a player who has, they are a person who has that same disability. You should work with them and figure out what they want out of that character, because some people want to play a character like Geordi LaForge, who uses a magical ability that allows them to have a similar capacity that we don't have in real life. But some people don't want to do that, and they want to play and just say, okay, but my other senses make up for it, and essentially we'll call it a wash. And sometimes they might want something else. The point is, it's different every time. So when you're talking about playing a PC who intentionally does not have one of the senses that the game might assume that most people have, you want to talk it out. You don't want to have a one-size-fits-all rule, because it's going to be a problem for some of the people who use it.
Great points.
So,
so we were talking about hearing, and Elftro mentioned smell as well, and not having a sense of smell, but using taste and smell metaphors. Like, yeah, absolutely. You don't have to have a sense in sort of in a particular way to use descriptions about that sense in a particular way. But you can there are other things. There are definitely like other things that you can focus on whenever you're not describing like one particular sense. So for example, like a character who's experiencing food and doesn't have a sense of smell is going to very likely notice things a lot more based on things like texture and temperature and stuff like that.
Yep. So all right, so
we're all good. So where were we?
We were smelling things.
We were smelling things.
So, it is possible to use scent out of character by, for example, if the PCs are in a place with the type of food you could like and taste, you could make that food, or you could like if they smell cinnamon, you could like have some actual cinnamon and have them smell cinnamon.
But you usually don't do that with.
It's very rare. That Wither King is you're so baffled by the face I was making, can't comprehend. Usually don't do that, although the sense of scent is very
tied to memory.
It is very tied to unconscious memories, so it can be.
Was that the sentence you were intending for me to finish?
Yes.
I thought so.
It was. So it can be used very effectively if you use it. It's just that most people don't. Because it is tied to memories in that way, you can take that into effect take that into account when you're describing things. So, like, you could talk about, like, if the PC smells something again, it's like, it reminds you of this other time that the first time you fought troglodytes, not you smelled this troglodyte stink. Yeah. And Elftro says it could be easy to accidentally bring back bad memories as well. That's definitely true.
So describing it, yeah, I'd say like when you're describing it, might be more like, well, this apple pie smells like the ones that they made back in the town you were from, and that kind of thing. Kid is talking about them being even more difficult to use over Roll20. I've
Oh,
mailed
yeah.
each of you a candle.
Light it now.
Yeah. So it's usually more a description of rather than a direct representation. And then as far as touch, I mean that often comes into play with showing how with showing the quality of things, like the difference between sleeping in a cheap inn and sleeping in a nice inn, or or having armor that you just kind of threw together versus something that's well worn in.
Or like this is smooth to the touch.
Yeah, or something being like smooth or rough, or being able to feel
slimy.
differences. Yes, exactly. It's not one that shows up as often, except for when PCs are like directly grabbing something.
It's very unusual for you to be able to use it for players, but I guess you could do one of those things where you like have a box with a hole that you stick your head in.
that old like spaghetti and peeled eyeballs like Halloween thing or whatever.
Stick your head, feel what's in here. Yeah, that's what your PC is feeling.
Yeah, Lydia spiders are. Yeah.
What about a naughty, Linda? But they're friendly.
I know they're friendly, but I just. Anyway, so that one's not gonna come with often. There's also
I mailed each of you a mystery box. Stick your hand in hole number 1.
There's also, some of the more unconventional senses. So certainly one that comes up in games because of how much people are hitting each other with sticks and setting each other on fire is pain. There's also temperature.
But there's proprioception.
Yes, your sense of balance too. Like if you're what's one of the things like underwater adventuring, like the feeling of pressure when you're underwater, or like feeling unbalanced or unsteady because you're walking on something strange, or because you've been poisoned, or because you're seasick, or any number of other situations. Those other senses don't usually get described as much, but they can also be very evocative when they do show up.
Mm-hmm. Or senses like that sort of sense of uneasiness or fear that's almost like the prey and the predator's vision sense that you sometimes get, that people can sometimes describe as a sixth sense of like danger sense.
Yeah, considering it talks about sense of spatial coordination, why you shouldn't fog of war places people have been. Or like how when you're in a place that's really familiar, even when the lights are out, you can still sort of see some of the outlines because your brain just fills them in.
Mm-hmm. And then there's fantasy senses.
Yes.
So.
Which I saw a good list of those. There's life sense.
There's a ton of them.
Sense and spore sense. And
so
all these kinds of things.
There's some fantasy senses that are not even necessarily fantasy, are more based on things that you could do in real life, because like our sense of sound is based off of waves that travel through the air. But there are senses in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, like wave sense or tremor sense, that are based off of waves traveling through a watery medium, like ripples in the water, or through the ground itself with tremor sense.
Or like being able to see UV light. There are animals that see wider ranges.
Or infrared.
Infrared light, or there are animals that see those just because we don't.
If you can see down into the infrared and heat, then that's like a heat sense. So all of those in Pathfinder 2nd Edition can be precise, which means they work kind of like vision, but just not using light waves, or imprecise, which means that they can basically give you the information of where something is, but they don't give all the full details about it like you would get with vision. Or another precise sense.
And those are definitely harder to convey to players, other than just like you have this information, because they don't have a sense that they can necessarily use for it. So coming up with some way to extend senses that they do have, like maybe you can describe the heat sense as like seeing these waves of a very deep red, or...
Wither Kings also pointed out that while we said for hearing that there could be echolocation, it's precise, we forgot scent for dragons and some other creatures. Like the Hobbit, I smell you, little thief. The dragon's scent goes very, very far out and is imprecise, so they can pinpoint your location just based on that. And even some animals with a very good sense of scent in the game have an imprecise scent, and you could theoretically have a precise scent, I guess. It'd be a little weird to have a precise scent just based on the fact that scent is based on like noticing the chemicals that are sort of like coming out from them into the air. So it's like, how did this give you all this this information about them?
But hypothetically,
are they really leaking that many chemicals into the air? But that there are other like special fantasy senses, motion sense that oozes have are able to just detect any amount of motion. So it's almost like wave sense, where they detect the movements of the water, but even just in air. There's also senses that detect some of the magical essences of the universe. The 4 essences, of course, being material essence. So I guess most of the things we've been talking about, like motion sense and wave sense, detect matter moving. But the other 3 being the mental essence or mind. So thought sense detects if anything has a mental essence. It might not have any matter to it. You're not going to be able to necessarily notice, even if you have a tremor sense or a wave sense, you're not necessarily going to be able to notice like a being of pure thought from that. But you would with thought sense. There's also life sense, which detects the life or vital essence of a creature, and that includes if it is the twisted use of negative energy to create, such as undead. And you could also have a spirit sense that senses souls or spiritual essence. I don't think that's very common compared to life sense or thought sense, though. But that would presumably be something that does not work on creatures that don't have a soul or spirit. And it's probably would be easier for that to see something that was like entirely a spirit, had the spirit trait, or a being from the outer spheres that's made out of spiritual essence, that's congealed into quintessence.
So I see a couple questions here. Is there a difference between sense X and X sense? Blood sense and sense blood. So there apparently there's something with blood sense and something with sense blood. They're asking is there a definitional difference between whether it comes first or second?
Not really.
It's probably just like the similar ability that.
Yeah. When it comes to any of those senses, they'll always say if they're not precise, they'll be like imprecise. They'll have a distance if it goes out to a distance like imprecise 60 feet. And then there'll be a description of what it does in the creature. If it's not one of the ones like scent that is just in a million different creatures.
I like this one. Hero sense. Only senses those destined for greatness, capable of acquiring hero points. Reaches through the 4th wall and says, "You are being controlled by people in another dimension."
I don't think that hero sense, like you said, is through the 4th wall, so nothing should ever have an ability that's in the game that it affects with hero points, because hero points are not in the game world. Just like Linda said, they're sort of in the 4th wall.
It is funny, though.
That's interesting that the Vampiric Mist has something that more, I think, should be called a blood sense or a sense blood. The Vitalia's should be called Hear Heartbeat, like the Banshee, because it's not about blood, it's about having a heartbeat. You could have a creature that is like the Telltale Heart from Edgar Allan Poe that has no blood and just has a beating heart, and the Vitalia should still be able to sense it.
And there's another one. Is there an alternative for True Sight if you're blind, or does the spell cover those bases?
So let's see the actual exact description of True Seeing. Because it does have the word seeing in its name. The flavor text is that you see them as they actually are, but the actual benefit is that the GM rolls a secret counteract check against all illusions and transmutations. But it doesn't destroy them. It's just to see if you can see through them. So I would say that True Seeing as written works for any of your senses. It's just that it doesn't destroy the spells like a Dispel Magic counteract. It just lets you sort of tell that they're an illusion or a transmutation? That's a good question, though. And there are definitely divinations that alter your senses, like true seeing.
Yeah.
The divination magic, especially certain subsets of divination magic, really go into senses. True smelling, the most powerful of spells. Rico is a very important spell for people who try to use negate aroma or illusions to disguise their sense, because they just didn't have enough time to wash up, so they just cast an illusion spell on themselves. True smelling also probably smells through your prestidigitation. It's a very important smell. It also lets you know who dealt it, in case it matters.
Asking the real questions.
Yes, asking the real questions. It's like, it was you. No, it wasn't you. I have true smelling.
Why do you waste a spell on that every day, so that I am never blamed unfairly?
Yep.
Anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have anything else to discuss on this topic?
I think we got through all the senses. Did everything make sense?
Alrighty then. Shall we say goodbye to YouTube?
Let's just do it. Bye.
Bye.
YouTube.